Hey Sai, I just saw your video and I wrote some notes as I was watching it, just kind of scribbled some notes. So if I'm a little bit rambling, I apologize. I liked your video, but I had to disagree with it in some senses, and I think you may have misunderstood a number of things I've said, probably because I didn't say them very well. The first thing that you talked about is that we can't disprove things in science, or you said that we can disprove things in science, and I thought that was very, very odd, because even though that's a very technically arcane thing, probably not worthy of us going on and on about, you're absolutely wrong. Any science textbook, Science 101 textbook that you'll get in any university will go out of its way to tell you that you cannot disprove things in science. That's one of the first things that I was taught when I was first holding scientific experiments working on my doctoral degree. You talked about how you can have a theory and you can say, well, if this theory is true, then we should see such and such. We don't see such and such, therefore it contradicts the theory. But you see, scientists aren't like that. They don't just use common sense. They think in the extreme. They want to think in the extreme so that any possibility can be looked at, so that their integrity is as complete as possible. If you don't find something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. It just means you didn't find it. As you know, people can run experiments for years, come to a particular conclusion, and then someone else comes along, they tweak the experiment just a little bit, and then they get completely different results. And then we realize that all these lack of results that we've been getting for decades excuse me, were the result of the way the experiment was done. As someone once said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So when you fail to prove a theory with some kind of research, that's all you've done, is fail to prove the theory. To talk about disproving theories, the only way you could do that is if you went all the way till the end of time, run every kind of experiment with every kind of variation you could think of, or variations you couldn't think of, and be able to somehow go through the entire universe to know that a certain thing doesn't exist. Most of us can't accomplish that. I realize that's a very arcane point, but it ends up being very important later, because there have been numerous times in the history of especially the social sciences where certain research was done, and it was we were absolutely cocksure we were right about something, and it ended up that we were wrong, because there was something about the way we did the experiment that no one could have foreseen would affect the effect of the experiment. For instance, doing experiments with rats, they had a number of belief systems about not just rats learning, but the learning of organisms in general, all of which had to be debunked, because it ended up that the researchers would wear white robes, white coats like researchers do, but sometimes they would be cleaned by their wives with a lot of bleach, and sometimes they wouldn't. And the rats could tell the difference between minute differences of white that our eyes can't see. And they were responding to that, and that was what the results were from. So when they made sure everybody had the same color coats, right, suddenly they got different results. So there could be a variable in an experiment that you don't even know about. So trying to show something and being unable to do so isn't disproof. It's simply evidence of absence, and evidence of absence is not necessarily something that proves an absence. It's almost impossible to prove an absence. But what I did say is, which is really weird, because the argument that I'm making that is absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is exactly the argument that theists make, which is that the absence of evidence of God doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't exist. They have a very good point. Theists are really being scientific when they make that point. But what I went on to say was that I had two issues. One was that, in science we posit something, and that's a hypothesis. Once we get enough evidence to show that the hypothesis is more than just a suggestion, then we have theories, and then theories become more and more well-known and more likely to be perceived as truth when we get more and more evidence. Where something goes from being a hypothesis and being a theory, and when something goes from a theory to a quote-unquote fact, there are many scientists who say we should never use the word fact because every theory is just one new scientific experiment away from being disproven. There are lots and lots of facts in science that have been proven wrong. But what I did say is that before something can even be a hypothesis, it needs to be a theory that's stated in language that is sensical given the definitions of the words that you're using. So I found your example of an elephant inside a bottle to be really bizarre because you said that that was something that could be proven false. Well, you're agreeing with me, you're not disagreeing with me. But the reason that that is false isn't because there's an experiment that you ran or because you did something scientific. The reason that the elephant inside the bottle is wrong is because it violates the definition of your bottle and the definition of the word elephant. So it isn't even a hypothesis to begin with. You couldn't even do research. Now, you could look inside the bottle and claim that was research or something like that, but in reality, you couldn't get anyone with any kind of money to do any kind of research to look inside of a bottle to see if there's an elephant there. And I find it weird that you're using an example which is a ridiculous example, which makes it therefore not applicable to what you were talking about, because anybody can come up with examples that are ridiculous. You know, it's like you can come up with an example that isn't really indicative of the thing you're talking about, and it's not a good example, so it doesn't really illustrate what you're saying. So the reason that elephant in the bottle is a wrong theory isn't because it's a wrong theory because you've proven it wrong somehow. It's because it isn't a theory to begin with, because it isn't even a hypothesis, because it doesn't even use language of a hypothesis. So you have a number of steps in science. Number one, you have to have a hypothesis in which you have variables that are stated that make sense and could be somehow related to each other. When you ask, is something inside of something else, and the thing that's supposed to be inside the something else is by definition larger, then you don't have a hypothesis to begin with. You have a nonsensical sentence. And that was my point that I was trying to make. We don't have evidence against God in the sense that we've run experiments and we have proven that God doesn't exist, because you can't prove anything doesn't exist in science through experiments. You also can't say that because of the absence of evidence we can say that there's an absent God. We can't do that either, and I think you're making a good point in saying that. But it's funny that your example of the elephant in the bottle seems to be a good example that supports my argument, not yours, which is that I'm contending that the vast majority of definitions of God that I have seen, and it seems to me like you're redefining God as God would be understood by a very small group of philosophers, or a hypothetical God that someone could imagine. And I find that kind of strange, because I'm more concerned about what gods are actually believed by actual average people out there, because I feel like that's the only thing that socially matters. Specifically, though, your elephant in a bottle is a lot like some of these definitions of gods. Gods with omnipotence, and gods with, the examples that you gave of a completely omnipotent God. You then started talking about how, well, what if a God isn't completely omnipotent, and what if we stretch this, and so on and so forth. And that was the point I was trying to make in my video. When someone starts taking the definition of something and changing the definition so that it can be true, or it's not non-contradictory, what are they saying? They're saying that their original conceptualization was wrong, which means they're saying their God doesn't exist. So now they're going to come up with something kind of close to God, or some other kind of God that might exist. Well, isn't that evidence of a need they have to have a God some way or somehow? Because it seems to me that the God that most people out there believe is the God with omnipotence, is the God with who is all powerful and is the God that doesn't seem to care to come down to earth to stop evil.